and welcome to Changing Minds. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. One of the earliest examples of messenger effects comes from the Greek philosopher Plutarch, who wrote, "The first messenger that gave notice of Lucullus's coming was so far from pleasing to Tigranes that he had his head cut off for his pains, and no man dared bring further information. Without any intelligence at all, Tigranes sat while war was already blazing around him, giving ear only to those who flattered him." Seems pretty laughable, but we've all seen examples of confusing the message and the messenger. Just a couple of weeks ago, Marcus Rochefort, a footballer from Manchester United, pleaded for the government to continue providing school meals for students who needed them over the summer. The campaign had been running for weeks without making any real headway, but then when Rochefort got involved, the government U-turned. Why should a footballer's influence have made such a difference when a series of experts in child development, economics, and social justice all failed? Clearly, the new messenger made the old message suddenly acceptable. These are both examples of messenger effects, and my guest today has studied these extensively. Joseph Marks is the co-author of the book, Messengers, Who We Listen To and Who We Don't, and Why. Joe wrote the book with Stephen Martin, and Joe joins me here today. Welcome to Changing Minds, Joe.
Thank you very much, Joe. Great to be here.
I'm so pleased you could join us today. Before we get started, I'd just like to invite our audience, as always, to share any questions that they have for Joe in the Q&A board as we go. You can do them as we go along, you can do them later, but towards the end of the session, we'll definitely try to get to as many of their questions as possible. Joe, I guess the place I'd like to start is just to ask you, how did you come to write this book?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it was back in 2016 when we actually had the idea, and it was an interesting time politically with the Trump election and the Brexit referendum. And, at the time I was working for a behavioral science consultancy called Influence Work, headed by Steve Martin and Robert Cialdini. And for those who don't know, Robert Cialdini is a very famous social psychologist. In fact, the most cited living social psychologist today, with the book Influence, that's right. And, they've written together, Steve and Cialdini. And, there's this kind of time, there was all this stuff happening where it seemed like there were people just accepting messages, not based on the merit of what was being said, but just because of who was saying it, which is the classic definition of a messenger effect. And, these cases seem to be happening every day. They're in the news. And one day, Steve actually turned to me on a plane and said, "We should write a book about this stuff." And so began a 2-year-long endeavor, which resulted in the book.
And it's such a good book too. I've really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. One of the first examples that you talk about is actually the mythical story of Cassandra. Would you share that? Because that one's so acute.
Yeah. So, one of the first kind of conceptions of a messenger that doesn't have this quality, an ineffective messenger, I guess, was Cassandra, who, we now talk about people who have the curse of Cassandra. And Cassandra was this character in Greek mythology who was given the gift of prophecy by the god Apollo. And so she could foresee all kinds of things, like the downfall of Troy, like soldiers in a wooden horse. She even foresaw her own death and how it would all play out. So she had knowledge, and she shared it with people who could benefit from listening to this kind of accurate information. And yet her downfall was that she was also cursed by Apollo, who, when I think she rebuffed his kind of romantic advances, decided he would make it so no one would ever listen to her or believe her again. So she had all this knowledge and she shared it with people, and yet nobody took any heed. And I think it's something that we see happening all the time in our own lives and in society today, where we might be in a meeting or a group of friends and put forward an idea that we think is quite good, and yet other people kind of ignore it or dismiss it. And then something remarkable happens where somebody else comes along and presents almost the exact same message or idea, and now everyone thinks it's the best idea since sliced bread. And that is familiar to all of us. And it speaks to this kind of effect that we talk about in the book, which is that it's not necessarily the message that's changing people's reaction. It can be more than that. It's the same message, it's the same people listening. It's only the messenger that changes, and yet people have a wholly different reaction.
This is another one of those biases that sort of illustrates that we're not as rational as we think we are. I mean, if the message doesn't change, surely our reaction to it doesn't change. But of course, that's just false. So let's get right into it then. What makes somebody a good messenger as opposed to a Cassandra?
Yeah, so I would say on that point, it's not entirely irrational all the time, because perhaps you're listening to a person who has subject matter expertise. They are a professor in this topic that you're interested in. It probably makes good sense to listen to them. And at the other side, there's these kind of more irrational biases where a person might have a kind of loud voice and a confident kind of demeanor, but actually they have no knowledge whatsoever, and there's a kind of timid, meek expert in the corner that nobody's listening to. So I think both are true. And actually, rather than just kind of poke out these interesting intuitive anecdotes, our approach was to look at all of the relevant kind of psychological literature and models, and there are decades of research into this in various subfields of psychology, behavioral economics, cognitive neuroscience even. And what I quickly realized was a lot of these models had a two-factor structure. So for example, in the stereotype literature, there's a prominent model that suggests people characterize social groups along the dimensions of warmth and competence.
Yes.
And in the leadership literature, there's models suggesting that there's two routes to status: dominance and prestige, and in face perception, you have these models of valence and power. And in source credibility, you have actually trustworthiness and subject matter expertise as the kind of two factors that should influence whether you perceive a source as credible or not. And so what we did was combine these various models by looking for common threads among them. And this led us to the conclusion that there seem to be two broad categories of messenger, which we call hard and soft messengers. But essentially, hard messengers is, nice audience-friendly lingo, really. But essentially, hard messengers have some form of superior status. They're influential in groups and societies because they're perceived to possess power or other useful qualities that would make them a good ally or a fierce foe. They have some instrumental value. Whereas soft messengers are influential because they are perceived to possess a connectedness with their audience. In contrast to society's hard messengers, who seek to win influence by getting ahead of others, soft messengers achieve influence by getting along with others. And we're social animals. We have a strong desire to form connections, so this kind of makes sense. We don't always look to those with high status for information. Sometimes we prefer to hear from our friends or people we trust or people who are like us. The other thing that this big kind of literature review, I guess, revealed was that there's various routes to achieving high status or high connectedness. And in the book, we outline 4 status-related and 4 connectedness-related traits, which each reliably influence whether people will listen to a messenger or not.
And for some of those hard traits, those status traits, I mean, one of them is fame, right? I mean, it's prestige. It's the Marcus Rochefort effect, right?
Yeah. So fame is probably what people think of when I say high status, and it is indeed an incredibly powerful messenger effect. And really early social psychological studies conducted back in the 1950s and 60s showed that, for example, people would be more likely to follow a jaywalker across the street into a red light if he was wearing a suit than if the same man was dressed in denim. And similarly, drivers would be less likely to honk at a luxury car that stalled at a red light than they were to honk at an old bank. And these studies show that we tend to treat people who display these kind of signals of wealth, we treat them better, and in the case of the jaywalker, are more influenced by their behavior. And Marcus Rochefort, a big celebrity, well, celebrities of course have huge influence because they're not just deemed worthy of their local group's attention, but of the public's attention more broadly, and usually admiration. It's interesting. People typically develop kind of unidirectional relationships with celebrities because we know them, they don't know us. And these relationships are actually very similar to, we feel emotions that are very similar to the kind we experience in day-to-day relationships. So we like some, we feel really attached to some, and not others. We dislike others. Celebrities' power over others' opinion for this reason has been long acknowledged by advertisers and marketers who have been using celebrities to endorse their products and services for about 150 years. And billions of dollars are spent on celebrity endorsements every year. I think in the US, it's about 25% of all advertisements include a celebrity. And in Japan, it's estimated to be between about 40 and 70%.
That's it's also strange, right? I mean, what is it about, your football expertise that allows you to talk about social policy, or, and I always think about George Clooney as the celebrity who I see most on TV. Why does George acting make me want to buy his coffee or whatever it is he's, endorsing?
Yeah, well, this star status kind of rubs off on the product that they're endorsing. And I think Marcus Rashford is an interesting case because he's not only famous and beloved by Man U fans and England football fans more generally, but also was able to draw on his own experiences of relying on free school meals and food banks growing up when he was calling on the government to provide free school meal vouchers to children from low-income backgrounds. So he not only had status and admiration, but he also had this kind of underdog backstory. And so if he stands up and partially attributes his success to a free school meals program, it's likely to have a big impact on people's perception of that program, for better or for worse. I think in this case it's for the better, but you can imagine in other cases where celebrities have undue influence, that it might not lead to such favorable outcomes. And there's kind of examples. One that kind of took our notice was a canto pop star who just casually, actually, in a WhatsApp group chat, said to some friends, without evidence and contrary to public opinion, that and all the medical consensus, that if you take a flu vaccine, you're 90% likely to catch the virus, rather than the other way around. And this kind of spread out of control. People forwarded it on, and pretty quickly health officials in China were scrambling to contain the rumor and to contain the damage that was done by having the message associated with this public beloved figure.
Yeah, that's really terrifying. The other thing that's really fascinating here are these kind of soft characteristics that you mentioned, things like humility. It almost seems the opposite of a lot of what we see in some of the most influential messengers at the moment. I mean, you mentioned the 2016 elections, and those are obviously high-profile examples. But there wasn't a lot of humility on show in those elections. And there isn't still, to some extent, in some of those governments. But in contrast, you have people like Microsoft's CEO, right, Satya Nadella, who kind of famously talks a lot about empathy and collaboration and working with people, which is a little bit different. Who are the humble messengers who are out there making a difference at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's very easy to think of political examples who are kind of harder messengers at the moment in particular. And in fact, we actually did some research before the general election last year, looking at how the public perceived the various contenders for the premiership on the 8 messenger traits that we outline in the book. And we found that right-wing politicians, so Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, were rated as high on dominance and charisma, while the left-wing politicians, and in particular the leader of the Green Party, Caroline Lucas, were rated as warmer, more caring, more trustworthy. And that was kind of across the board. I mean, we looked at the party allegiance of the participant as well. So people who were on the left are more likely to rate left-wing politicians highly, and vice versa. But across the board, that seemed to be a general trait. And actually, it's a long-acknowledged effect in political science and political psychology that liberals typically prefer softer, warmer leaders, while conservatives tend to prefer harder, more dominant leaders. But I would say the context matters too. And research by two Danish researchers showed that dominant leaders typically thrive when conflict, competition, and uncertainty arrive. But in calmer, surer times, the reverse is generally true. One more, I guess, thing to note on the kind of Boris Johnson effect that I think is super interesting is that while we found Boris Johnson tends to be perceived as dominant, and at the time we did the study, I think he was proroguing Parliament. So
Yep.
be hard to argue trustworthy at the time, but it was interesting to see what happened in kind of March, April time while he was in hospital with coronavirus. And actually, you might think his perceptions of him would maybe go down, be seen as reckless. He was constantly shaking hands with people and maybe not taking it as seriously as he should. But actually, his approval ratings went through the roof while he was in hospital. So it's not that he was doing a good job at the time. He was unable to work, in fact. But people seem to be warming to him for a different reason. He went from being a kind of dominant, charismatic messenger to being a vulnerable messenger in that context. And rather than harm his approval ratings, they actually massively helped him.
Yeah, that's remarkable. It's nice to see, though, that you're not sort of typecast into one area, that there is some flexibility, and that's a particularly nice example. You also mentioned charisma as an important characteristic when you were discussing right there. What makes somebody a charismatic messenger?
Yeah, so it's funny. It's one of those hard to define gifts. And, people know it when they see it, but actually if you ask people what is charisma, they tend to talk more about its outcomes, so or some abstract, vague terms. And it was even in 2016, a big review on the topic came out in a psychological journal saying it's an ill-defined gift and we need to actually figure out what this thing is and give it a definition. And so one of the things that seems to kind of define charisma is value-laden leadership signaling. So I'll break that down in terms of what it means. It kind of means like it's basically a contest for a leadership position that people are signaling how good a leader they would be, and they do this through expressing their values. And they do this through a number of routes. So one is essentially articulating a collective vision that their kind of followers can buy into, and that essentially will suppress kind of individual self-concerns and raise these kind of superordinate group level concerns. So the idea or the hope of a charismatic leader is that people will put aside their own self-interest. People would say, in the case of kind of Martin Luther King, would say, I'm not going to worry about the personal risk of going to a protest. I need to do this because it's something, that I can do for the cause, for a greater good, greater than myself. So even if I might get beaten up by police or whatever is the case, I'm going to put aside that self-interest and do something bigger. The second main part of charisma is how they articulate that information, that vision. They do it through surgency, which is kind of in personality psychology or lingo, very similar to extroversion, kind of synonymous with extroversion, in fact. So the way that they communicate is in a kind of energetic, optimistic manner. And, this kind of seeps through. There's very much an emotional contagion when a charismatic speaker communicates, and it gets people kind of pumped up. And there's fascinating studies showing that, when participants view 10 seconds of a silent video of teachers speaking, they can basically predict how well that teacher is going to do in their end of term evaluations, just based on that kind of non-verbal behavior of optimism, confidence, enthusiasm in the way that they speak. So, if you put aside what the hell the teacher is saying and assume that they have good content, or not maybe, then actually it largely comes down to that charismatic way of speaking that affects what students will think of them and rate them in the end.
Fantastic. Cool. Well, and speaking of an educational context, I believe you're actually doing your PhD at the moment, right? So are you working on this? And if so, what is the current state of the art that you found?
Yeah, so I am doing, I'm studying this topic in my PhD, and have been particularly interested in looking at kind of trade-offs between competence and other traits. So if you can see that actually one particular messenger is very competent at a task, they seem to be getting a lot of questions correct, they know their stuff, and you get a choice of who to listen to, would you be biased if you also knew that they had very different political leanings to you, for example? So if you could see that they were quite good at the task, but actually were a big believer that a wall across the southern border of the US would reduce violent crime, and you don't believe that yourself, would you still choose to hear their kind of advice on this non-political task? And what we find is that actually, even when it shouldn't, from a rational perspective, political similarity does seem to have an effect on who we listen to. So knowing that somebody shares my political beliefs gives them some kind of extra credit in my mind. And the reason is that we actually perceive them as more competent at this unrelated task than they really are. So even though we present all the evidence, we show them exactly who the expert in the room is, people don't tend to keep track of it that well. They're biased by these other factors. These other messenger traits seem to seep into their evaluations. And it's known as a halo effect, I guess, more generally.
That's really striking. I mean, the idea that I could actually know that, person A is actually pretty good at this task, and if I want advice on this task, I should ask A, but I don't really like their politics. They don't match mine, and therefore I'm going to ask Joe Bloggs over here who's not any good at the task.
Yeah, right, exactly that. They go to somebody and ultimately end up with suboptimal outcomes because they are, kind of biased by these messenger effects. Yeah.
That is remarkable. Okay, well, I look forward to getting an update on your work as it keeps going, because you're doing some really fascinating stuff. I'm sensitive to the fact that we have some questions from our audience, and if it's okay with you, I'd like to turn to some of those. Is that all right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So Al has asked, how can you turn around a bad messenger? How do they change their spots, I think is the phrasing here.
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question. When we lose trust, how do we regain it? And it does depend slightly on, I guess, why we've lost trust in the first place. Because if it's a lack of perceived competence, for example, then you would think that through enough kind of repeated positive examples of performing competently, people would start to learn and change their opinion. Even though these opinions can be sticky and hard to change, but over time and with enough positive kind of reinforcement, they can change. And that's true as well, not just of competence, but also of trust. So actually, there's some interesting research showing that if somebody has betrayed you a few times in one of these economic exchanges or economic games that researchers like to use, then if they then promise that they're actually going to start, they realize they're wrong and they're going to start acting nicely from now on, people do, after a while, after they've seen some evidence, start to trust them again a little bit. But what was particularly striking in this study was that it depended on how the participant themselves thought about people. And if they thought that leopards could change their spots, they were more likely to then start trusting again. Mm-hmm. If they had a more kind of fixed mindset, I guess you might call it, where they thought once a cheater, always a cheater, they were less likely to then believe that a messenger could change. So it, in part, I think, depends on the perception of the observer, I guess you'd call them, as well as kind of having enough evidence out there that change is possible.
And it seems like from your work that another dimension to that would be sort of knowing your audience and trying to make a connection in a way that's more about the audience and not so much about the topic. So if you got yourself closer to the audience, does that help?
Yeah, yeah. So you're saying that, you could connect on some other dimension. Perhaps, it reminds me as well of, again, some very old work in social psychology by Elliot Aronson, who coined the term the pratfall effect. Because essentially what he did was had a person spill a cup of coffee over themselves. And you may be familiar with this study. But they had people rate how likable and how competent this person was. And they were either introduced in the first place as kind of a very competent expert, went to a prestigious school, knew their stuff, or they were presented in the first place as quite an incompetent fellow. And so the question was, would spilling this cup of coffee affect that? And what they found was actually, if you were already perceived as competent, sometimes you have this stereotype of being competent but cold. And so what they found was that if you make a kind of little blunder, a human mistake, people actually warm to them. And so they became more effective messengers by making a mistake. But on the other hand, if they were perceived as incompetent, making this blunder and spilling a cup of coffee on themselves kind of reinforced this pre-existing opinion. And now, rather than being judged as kind of more likable, they were judged as less likable, and it kind of reinforced their stereotype that this was an incompetent person.
That seems very much like the example you gave with Boris catching COVID, right? Because I think he is often seen as a little bit distant and cold. But that was an example where people seemed to warm to him a little bit, and he became a little bit more human in that circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's another really good question here, which is what does age and experience have to do with being listened to as a messenger?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Again, actually, in the stereotype literature, then there's evidence that the kind of sage, elderly, wise messenger who's in their 90s doesn't really exist. And actually, when it comes to competence, there's a bit of an inverted U. So we think that children are kind of maybe not to be taken so seriously. As you grow up, and especially as you kind of get into your 30s, 40s, 50s, middle age, that kind of peak of status, I guess, people are listened to more, they're seen as more competent. And then as they get more and more old, they get into this kind of elderly category, which is seen as warm. We have positive feelings for them, and they're seen as kind of caring, but they're also seen as less competent. So they have some reduced status, and that comes at a cost.
Is that why people who do the news typically are sort of in their 30s, 40s, maybe late in the 50s, but you don't tend to see either much younger or much older people, on the TVs telling us about what's happening in the world?
Yeah. No, I think that makes good sense. And of course, there are exceptions. So maybe David Attenborough is a good example. But these tend to be exceptions to the rule rather than the rule of thumb. And whatever it is that they have done to get to that point where their kind of credibility can survive throughout old age is more testament to what they've done in their life, I guess. Yeah.
Sure. Let me see, there's some other questions that have come in. One of them is just, what do you think is actually more important, liking the messenger or knowing the messenger is competent? And this sounds like your work.
It does. And my work would suggest that the kind of similarity effect seems to trump the accuracy effect. The similarity trumps competence. I don't know if that's necessarily a general rule that I would say is always true. And again, it kind of depends on the context and on the motivations of the perceiver, because if you have high accuracy motivation, for example, if the stakes are really high and you know nothing about the subject, you might be more inclined to go to a doctor than your friend or your family member or somebody who shares your political views. Whereas if the stakes are quite low, and maybe it's some kind of conspiracy theory that's going around, and actually it doesn't really matter at an individual level whether I believe a conspiracy theory or not.
Sure.
It's not going to affect my life too much unless I start building bunkers and whatnot. But I mean, you know, at that kind of base level, I may well be inclined to listen to, you know, a friend who's as suspicious as I am and seems to share my worldview, as opposed to somebody with a whole load of degrees in political economy, for example.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess that comes, you know, you saw that in Michael Gove saying, I think this country's had enough of experts, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And that was the topic that was primarily around Brexit, right? Where it does affect us, but it wasn't so obvious exactly how, and it certainly wasn't an immediate thing. And therefore, you know, tribalism played a big role in sharing those messages.
Yeah, and it's a hard one too, because, you know, there's also work on kind of forecasting showing that expert or pundits' forecasts are actually no better than chance sometimes, depending on the topic. So, I mean, Philip Tetlock is very famous for some of this work. And so on some level, you can think, well, you know, maybe you can see why they are suspicious of these kind of overly confident pundits in particular, who have been saying things and you know, often shown to be wrong in hindsight, and while at the same time, you know, promising things will get better for people who experience no change in their daily life.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sensitive to the time. I've run things a little bit over because it's so interesting and I'm enjoying this so very much. Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you very much.
I'd like to thank my guest, Joseph Marks, author of Messengers, Who We Listen to and Who We Don't, and Why. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, me too. Thanks a lot for having me on.
That's my pleasure. Next week, we're going to be talking about behavioral science in banking. I hope you can join us then, everyone. Take care.